Right at the end of Parashas Mishpatim, the Torah describes Moshe going up onto Mount Sinai, and Rashi picks up in the language of the Torah that there's something very unusual happening about the cloud or the smoke that was over the mountain. So we'll analyze what Rashi wants us to understand, what relevance it has to the nature of the story, and also to what it is to be a Jewish person working to elevate the world to become a holier place. So B'siyum HaSedra, right at the end of the parasha, where it says that Moshe entered inside the clouds, Rashi says, Onan zeh, this particular cloud, as we'll see, he says this cloud was actually similar to smoke. Now that's strange, because it doesn't really seem to make sense. Onan wird b'chlal getaycht Volkan. Generally, the translation of the word Onan is cloud. And Oshan meant roich, whereas Oshan means smoke. And not only are they two different things, they're actually opposites. Not only are they different, a cloud and smoke are not the same, but besides the Nochmer, they're actually produced through opposite processes. Because Onan wird geschaffen von Mayim, clouds are due to the evaporation of moisture that becomes cloud. Und Oshan von Eish, smoke is the product of fire. So if that's the case, then we have two questions. Aleph, from wann nennt Rashi Taishan do Onan anders wie überall? What prompts Rashi here to translate the word Onan in a different way to anywhere else in the Torah? And second of all, Beis, what about the pasuk is difficult to understand? That Rashi has to explain in the first place. I mean, we understand what a cloud is. We don't need Rashi's assistance. Before we can analyze that, we're going to see something else that Rashi says a little bit further as he wraps up the parasha. Rashi continues to say that Eibishter made a corridor for Moshe in the smoke or in the cloud in order for him to enter. Where does Rashi get that from? It's actually a Gemara in Yuma. The Mokah for the Minyan is in Gemara, but when the Gemara talks about how Moshe Rabbeinu was in the cloud, it's actually in context of a particular question. The question is if there's stiritz vision zwei psukim. There are two psukim that seem to contradict each other. Ksiv, the one pasuk says, which we're still going to learn later on in Parashas Pekudei, that Moshe could not enter Ohel Moed because there was this thick cloud over it, and he couldn't get in. On the other hand, here our pasuk says that Moshe entered into the cloud. So which one? Could he enter or could he not enter? To resolve that, the Gemara says, the very Rabbi Shmuel Tana, they taught in Rabbi Shmuel's yeshiva, Ne'emar kan b'soich. In our parasha it uses the word b'soich, that he came inside the cloud, which makes a gzera shava, because v'ne'emar alon b'soich. We know at the time of Kriyas Yamsuf, it also says that they came b'soich hayom into the middle of the sea. The pasuk is vayvoy b'nei Yisrael b'soich hayom. So mal alon shvil, as we know, to cross the sea, Hashem made corridors through the water, and that's represented by the word b'soich. So dechsiv amayim lo'im choyma, where the Torah describes that the water became walls on either side of them. Avkan, says the Gemara, shvil over here too, when Moshe went into the cloud on Har Sinai, it is a corridor. So we understand why the Gemara has to get into that detail, because the Gemara is looking to resolve an apparent contradiction between psukim. Rashi is not doing that. You can't tell me that Rashi here in Parashas Mishpatim is looking to address the apparent contradiction between the pasuk in our parasha and the pasuk in Pekudei, and therefore he says there was a corridor in the cloud. Because we'll only become aware of the fact that there's any contradiction much later on when we get to Parashas Pekudei, and we learn this reference in Parashas Pekudei. Right? In Pasuk v'lo yochel Moshe Gomer in Parashas Pekudei. Hat Rashi gedacht find from die Stira wenn sie wird dorten. So logically, Rashi, if he felt that there's an issue of the contradiction or apparent contradiction between two psukim, would have typically addressed it when the contradiction becomes known, which is only in Parashas Pekudei. Why would he address it here? So really the question is, why does Rashi feel the need to tell us that there's a corridor for Moshe through the cloud? Muslim Zogan. So we're going to have to say, the fact that Rashi feels that he has to address how it is that Moshe was able to walk through the cloud And the answer to that is that Abishter provided a corridor for him. Is nit der Fall was später sagt der Pasuk. It's not because later on there'll be a pasuk that says that Moshe was not able to push his way through the cloud, and that's a major contradiction. So there's got to be something right here in the story at this point, without any future knowledge, that already implies that Moshe should not be able to go into the cloud, and is tamur. That's really strange. Why is it strange? Because we've already seen that Moshe entered not only the cloud, but even something thicker than the cloud. Rashi's Mefarish Freer. Rashi previously in Parshas Yisro explained the words that say, Diverta Moshe nigash elho arafel, that Moshe entered into the fog. As das meint lifnim misholish mechitzes. Rashi explains that arafel means Moshe entered through 3 barriers: choshech, darkness; anon, cloud; varafel, and the fog. Das heißt, so we already know from Parshas Yisro, in the context of Har Sinai, as Moshe is durchgegangen nicht bloß durch choshech ve'anon, or durch harafel. That Moshe was not only able to get his way through the darkness and the cloud, but even through the thick fog. Was is Rashi teich dorten av he'anon? Rashi explained to us already that harafel is an unusually thick cloud. Und von deswegen war nicht Rashi wie hat dort gekannt durchgehen. And in Parashas Yisro, Rashi didn't feel the need to tell us how this was possible, how Moshe was able to permeate that thick cloud. Is there fun muchach, which then indicates, as beim Ben Chomish mikra, is es mikarken kashenit wie Moshe can durchgehen demonan. So then the 5-year-old is learning Chumash, who sees that Rashi doesn't have an issue with Moshe making his way through not only choshech and anan, but even arafel. So the 5-year-old says, well, here Moshe goes through the cloud, big deal. Okay, we know it's not a problem. Truth is, anybody's had an experience. You can walk through cloud, you can walk through fog. Even if there's no corridor to get you through. So why does Rashi have to dafka address the need for a corridor in our pasuk when apparently we didn't even raise the question? So in order to understand this, we've actually got to work out what's bothering Rashi. That was one of our original questions. What is not clear in the pshat that Rashi has to even address the story of the cloud in the first place? So the question that's glaring in this pasuk is like this. The Torah has already told us that cloud covered the mountain. And that means, as the har is given badekt miteinander. That means that it was almost obscured, right? You can imagine that the peak of the mountain was shrouded in clouds. So now that we know that the top of the mountain is enshrouded in clouds, then we know that when Moshe climbs the mountain, he's obviously going into the clouds. Because I know where the cloud is on top of the mountain, now I know that Moshe is going up the mountain, I know that Moshe is going into the clouds. Why does the Torah have to spell that out for me and say, and Moshe went into the cloud? We know that, we can work it out. Now, you might have a similar question to say, well, if it's already telling us that Moshe came up the mountain, why does it have to say again that Moshe climbed the mountain? After it had already told us previously that Moshe climbed the mountain, then it was covered with clouds. That's easier to resolve. That repetition makes a lot of sense. There are 2 opinions about exactly when it is that Moshe went up the mountain, and according to either opinion, it makes sense for the Torah to have to repeat itself. Those 2 opinions are quoted by Rashi, and both of them have good reason why the Torah would have to repeat the information that Moshe is climbing the mountain. Let's go with the first view, which is the first view is, when did Moshe climb up the mountain? Is given inem tog fun Matan Torah. That refers to the day of Matan Torah. So daf the pasuk das sibechazren. The Torah has to repeat that information because it, so to speak, distracted us for a moment. Weil in mitten hat the pasuk mafsik given mit dem zman von far Matan Torah. Because the Torah started to tell us about Moshe going up the mountain, and then it digressed to tell us about the preparation before the Torah was given. For example, that the cloud cover was there for 6 days, and then on the 7th day Hashem called Moshe to the mountain. So because there was a digression, the Torah comes back to its original point, as we often see the Torah do, and repeats itself and says Moshe is climbing the mountain. That's according to the first opinion, who says that the Moshe climbing the mountain happens on the same day as Matan Torah. And certainly, like that Zweite day, according to the other opinion, which is that this is now Moshe climbing the mountain at a later time, that the 2 times the Torah speaks about Moshe climbing up the mountain are actually 2 different occasions, one at the time of Matan Torah and one a few days later to get the Luchos. So the first time we're told Moshe climbs the mountain, that's straight after Matan Torah. And the one in our parasha that he goes up and into the clouds is given in them Yom Hashvi noch Matan Torah. That's the 7th day after Matan Torah. Okay, so that was an aside, because we've raised that the big question Rashi is bothered by is, why do we have to be told that Moshe is going into the cloud when we already know that it's the cloud? And we're just saying, well, it's not going to be a similar question about why it has to say that he's climbing the mountain again, because there's reason to believe that they're 2 separate occasions, or perhaps there was a digression in the middle. It's the fun mashma. So because the description of Moshe going into the cloud is apparently unnecessary, we have to say that the pasuk wants to tell us something with those words. In other words, as the onavas steht da is nicht derselbe onavas wird der Mond in the Friedike Psukim, and therefore it would seem that the Torah is illustrating to us, now we're talking about a different cloud. Earlier we spoke about the cloud that was on the mountain for 6 days, and now Vayovoy El He'anan, Moshe is coming into the cloud on his second ascent, according to the one opinion, or even on his original ascent, and it's not the same cloud. So the question is, what's not the same about it? Wer doch de Shaila? Was is given ad der Anan? So what is this cloud, and how is it different from the original cloud? To answer that, Dr. Rashi, Anan Zeh, this cloud described in this pasuk, from dem pasuk, Kemin Ashan, who is cloud that is actually more similar to smoke. Okay, what does that mean? The original reference to cloud in previous psukim and even in the previous parasha, those Rashi doesn't have to explain what kind of cloud that is, because cloud we assume to be cloud. It was a literal cloud that also represented or revealed Hashem's greatness to the world. And that's no different to the column of cloud that used to accompany the Jewish people throughout their sojourn in the desert, as where the Eibishter walked or led in front of them during the day, with a column of cloud. And likewise, and at night it was a column of fire. And that's Anon Kipshutoi. Every other reference to cloud, even if it's cloud that includes Hashem's glory, is literal cloud. Except for this pasuk. We have to say that the fact that the Torah is drawing our attention to the fact that this cloud is the one Moshe goes into, as das given an under min anon, that says Rashi, is illustrating to us it's a different type of cloud. And Rashi has explained what it is. So he explains this cloud is different because it is more similar to smoke than to a cloud. Okay, so Rashi has to tell us that the cloud is different. Why does he have to say that it's like smoke? Surely there's other ways that the cloud could be different. The hechach from Rashi, as Onan Zekimin Ashan, is from the Psukim Gufa. Rashi extrapolates, how do we know that this cloud is like smoke? Look at the context of the Psukim. In between the words where the Torah describes how Hashem summons Moshe up onto Mount Har Sinai, and when Moshe actually goes up on Har Sinai, in between that is the pasuk. They have the pasuk that says, the appearance of Hashem's honor at that moment was like a fire that consumes on top of the mountain. Something doesn't make sense about the order of the psukim over here. Der pasuk als gedav stein fire vayikral Moshe. Surely the pasuk that describes this fiery appearance at the top of the mountain belongs before the pasuk that talks about Moshe being summoned up the mountain, because then it would be behemshach tzu vayishkoin kavoid Hashem. Then it would be, the Torah tells us that Hashem's presence was on the mountain, then it should describe what that looked like, this devouring fire, and then it should have told us the story that Moshe was called up onto the mountain. That would make perfect sense, because then you've said there is the kavod of Hashem on the mountain, and this is what it looks like. Why are we given the description of the fact that there's Hashem's glory on the mountain, then the fact that Hashem calls Moshe, and then the idea that there's this fiery, consuming fire on top of the mountain? So, Lomi boy Leute deas Vaikra Moshe Gomer is given by Mashvi noch Matan Torah. Definitely, according to the view that says when Moshe is being called up the mountain, that's a week after Matan Torah has happened. When the Eibishter hat gerufen Moshe and Azal Aruf gain and Mekabel sein die Luchos, where the Eibishter is calling Moshe to come and actually get the physical Luchos. Und Vayavai Moshe v'Gomer is given the Enfer of the Kriya, and the response to Hashem's calling is Moshe going up the mountain. So then, hat doch kein Ort nicht zum Afsik sein zwischen Vayikra Moshe und Vayavai Moshe. Then it really, according to that view, would make absolutely no sense to pause in the middle of Vayikra, Vayavai. Hashem calls him, and he comes with a description of what the mountain looks like, which we should have already known a week earlier. Und Vayavai Moshe, dein Ausfolg, die Kriya mit einem Pasuk und Mara Kvoid Hashem. It really doesn't make sense that you have an instruction, and then the response to that instruction interrupted by a description of the scene. The truth is, even according to the first opinion, which is as Vayikra Moshe is given loyma aser sadibros, that when Moshe was called up to the mountain, that is at the time of Matan Torah, to be able to share the aser sadibros with the Yidden. And as Rashi says, the whole Jewish people were also standing there, but the Eibishter wanted to give special respect and dignity to Moshe Rabbeinu. Nicht as the Eibishter hat gerufen Moshe and Aruf zu gehen auf den Har. Not that at that time the Eibush is actually yet calling him up the mountain. He's just singling Moshe out. And then when the Torah describes that Moshe goes into the cloud, is not directly a response to Hashem calling Moshe. Hashem's calling Moshe to say, he will be my point man. Later on, Moshe will actually climb the mountain, and they're not necessarily related. Von deswegen ist euch Mishpatim as the Tirinian from Mara Kvoid Hashem Gomer. Even then, when you could justify splitting the pasuk of Vayikra from the pasuk of Vayavai, still it doesn't make sense to split the pasuk of Mara Kvoid Hashem, that the appearance of Hashem's honor is like this devouring fire. Es soll stehen gleich bei Hemshach zu Vayishkan Kvoid Hashem al Sinai, whereas it should have rather just followed on immediately after telling us that Hashem's kavod is expressed at Har Sinai. So because of this unusual structure of the psukim, we get the beginning of a description, then the beginning of an instruction, then the end of the description, and then the response to the instruction. Therefore Rashi is seeing in this flow, Rashi identifies that by describing the devouring fire, the consuming fire on the top of the mountain, that helps us understand the context of Moshe coming into the cloud. Rashi is seeing in that description of this consuming fire, he is seeing a description, or at least an allusion to what kind of cloud it is. Which leads the pasuk to then say, and Moshe went into that cloud. Rashi understands that this particular cloud is a cloud of smoke, the result of the consuming fire that's on top of the mountain. It is similar in its behavior, in its constitution, to smoke. Was ist gekommen von der Cheles, was steht in Friedrich Pasuk, and that smoke would have been produced by the consuming fire described in the previous Pasuk. Now, if Rashi is coming from that perspective, that we're effectively getting a description of what the nature of the fire was or the smoke was on top of the mountain, and therefore there's this distinction between this cloud and other clouds. This is not just an ordinary cloud. This is cloud that is associated with Hashem, with smoke. With that, we can understand why the Torah doesn't just say that there was fire on top of the mountain, but specifically fire that consumes. Because Telchayr is nicht verstandig. Really, that doesn't seem to make sense. If the objective of the pasuk over here is to describe what the vision, what the appearance of Hashem's glory looks like, is fire, and then just say it looks like fire. That's what it appears. That is the physical manifestation of Hashem's presence. How does it add, or why is it necessary to add that it's the fire that consumes? Well, Rashi's approach makes it perfectly clear for us. The issue is not just simply what it looks like, but what it produces. Because the purpose of that description of the consuming fire is to give us clarity on the following pasuk, which is Vayova Moshe b'soichei Onan, that Moshe enters the cloud. As der Onan is given an Oshon, was hat sich geschaffen von dem, was Mare Kved Hashem is given Ka'esh, where Rashi is showing us that the pasuk wants us to know the cloud that Moshe enters is the product of the fiery presence of Hashem on the mountain. The Rabbi is the pasuk Moshe for Madgish Ka'esh Oicheles. That's why the pasuk doesn't just say fire, but says consuming fire. Weil an Oshon wird nicht von Eish allein, because smoke is not the product of just fire. If you've ever been in a laboratory, you get certain very pure fuels that don't produce smoke. Now, for an eish was is oicheles. What produces smoke is when the fire consumes impurities. It burns up whatever the particular wick or material, the flammable material that it's burning. So it has to be ka'esh oicheles in order to produce smoke. It has to be burning something in order to produce smoke. If you can even add to this, historically, up until this point, we know that if there's a divine fire, it actually doesn't consume physical things. How do we know that? Remember from the burning bush. Moshe saw that there was this thorny bush that was completely consumed in fire, and the bush wasn't burning up, it wasn't getting consumed. So it's unusual for divine fire to actually burn product. Therefore, the pasuk has to emphasize here, as do is given an eshocheles. The Torah needs us to know that this fire is not your classic divine fire. It is a fire that actually consumes physical things. That's why it produced this plume of smoke that looks like a cloud, but actually it is like smoke. Okay, now that we know that will help us understand the need for a corridor, for practical reasons, actually. That's why Rashi has to tell us that that Eibusha created a corridor for Moshe through this smoky cloud. Why is that relevance? It's because of how Rashi has explained, and as a result of what Rashi has told us, that there has to be a corridor. If the cloud on the mountain at this point in time was the same natural cloud that was described in the earlier psukim, it wouldn't be necessary for the pasuk or anybody to explain to us how Moshe made his way through the cloud. Because, as we already know, Moshe didn't seem to have an issue getting through much thicker cloud, so there's no reason to explain it. But this is not an ordinary cloud, and it's not the same cloud that was mentioned before. Rather, this cloud is smoky. And the nature of smoke is because of the impurities, the soot of what is produced in the combustive process. So what happens when you walk through smoke? You become smoky. And you become blackened from the soot, from the smoke. And not only the person, the clothes as well. If that's the case, so Moshe is walking through this smoky cloud, what's it going to look like on the other side? It'll look like a chimney sweep. That raises a massive question. Is it possible that was Moshe's experience? And Moshe arrives in front of the Eibishter to receive the luchos blackened from top to toe, in a way that is completely undignified. That's the issue Rashi has. Not how does he get through the smoke or the cloud, but how does he get through and still look like a mensch? To that Rashi answers, that the Eibishter made a nice clean corridor for him, and Moshe is gegangen in dem Shvil Beifen as der Oshon hat ihm nicht berührt, and he was able to walk right through this protected corridor inside the smoke and not be affected negatively by the smoke. So now we understand why Rashi tells us it's cloud that is similar to smoke because of the context of the psukim and why we need a corridor, because once we know it's smoke, he has to be protected. There's still other questions though. Es bleibt aber nicht verstandig. Aleph. First question is, why does Rashi say it's cloud that is similar to smoke? The way we've just described it is smoke. So why does Rashi not just say it is smoke? Question 2b is, if a taka is smoke, why didn't the pasuk just say it? Why does the pasuk say cloud when it actually means smoke? So for that, picture the scene of what Har Sinai looks like, and remember how combustion works, and will help us understand. It's the Bir Bozeh. The Har Sinai in Midbar Sinai. Where is the Har Sinai? It's in a desolate desert area. If you've ever climbed a mountain, you know that the peaks of mountain tend to have little to no vegetation. And it's the peak of the mountain where there's this great display of godliness that is supposed to appear like a fire. Things don't grow in deserts, and certainly not on mountain peaks. It's a place which is stone and sand. Again, if you've climbed a high mountain, you'll know this. Smoke occurs when something combustible burns, like vegetation. You cannot light sand, you cannot light a rock, and it's certainly not going to produce smoke. So therefore, for practical reasons, Rashi has to say, they can't be that there was actual real smoke because there wasn't anything really flammable. Now, there was a cloud that appeared like smoke. The cloud produced by the burning up of the rock and stone on Har Sinai is given as that cloud was like smoke. Like ordinary smoke, which would be the product of ordinary burning materials. For that practical reason, that it's not actual regular smoke, and the Torah won't call it smoke, it will call it anon. It will call it a cloud. Now that we've resolved all of the technical questions of Rashi's interpretation, so we understand that there's a cloud which isn't quite a cloud because it's supposed to represent the concept of burning up things on the mountain, but nothing's really burning, so it's only the perception of something burning because that's supposed to represent Hashem's, so to speak, appearance, and that's why it's a big deal for us that Moshe goes into this cloud and it's a different cloud and he has to have some kind of protection so he's not harmed or dirtied by the cloud. Now let's understand what all of this means in spiritual terms. The wine of Rashi's interpretation. The idea that there was smoke on the mountain is something the Torah said very clearly in the previous parasha Yisro, where it says, "V'har Sinai oshan kuloi." The entire Sinai was smoking, because the Eibishter descended onto the mountain in fire. Okay, so now this is interesting. Yisro describes smoke on the mountain. Mishpatim describes the same incident and describes cloud on the mountain. Why the distinction? As we've already identified, smoke is produced by the material that is burning. Because the material is material, physical, then the fire destroys the material state of that object. So the destruction, the dismantling of the physical entity produces the smoke. That's why you get different kinds of smoke, depending on what material is burning. If you have something which is a lighter material that's burning, let's say paper, it's going to burn up much quicker, so the smoke will last for less time. So what's going to happen then is the kind of smoke that you have won't be so thick, and it will be sparse. So in other words, it won't be like a black smoke, and it won't be a thick smoke. But if what's burning is something which is very thick, so to speak, and very materialistic, let's say plastic or fuel, is done the Ocean gedichter und greber und größer. There'll be more, thicker, darker smoke. But that is verstandig. That helps us to understand, as in dem Ocean von jeder Sache is nikar, by looking at and assessing the smoke of any item while it burns. It gives you a sense, gives you a sense of how lowly, how crass the material was. Darker, blacker smoke, more crass material. So as the thing is burning up and effectively disappearing, we're getting to understand it better. Now, Zovidos is begashmius, in the same way as you have the range of smoke, depending on the materialism of physical things. You have a similar scale that applies in the spiritual terms. In the reinterpretation of physical things to become holy or godly items. When we reveal godliness, which is represented by fire, like for example the fire that descends from heaven to eat karbonos, so that's revealing godliness in the world. That consumes and dismantles the sense of self that is so prevalent in the world, and allows the world to surrender itself and to become one with Hashem, to let go of its own identity and become consumed or subsumed by Hashem's identity. That's what smoke represents. When the world is undergoing a process of losing its own identity and being elevated to a godly reality, that is represented in spiritual terms by smoke. And there's two kinds of smoke described in Parshas Yisro and Parshas Mishpatim, which are two different phases of bringing godliness into the world. The pasuk v'asina oshan kuloi, when we speak about the fact that the whole mountain is full of smoke in Parashas Yitzroi, retzach v'gan zman matan Torah. That's the time when the Torah is being given. Because the experience of divine revelation that happens at Har Sinai is initiated by Hashem from above. As the Torah says, because Hashem descended onto the mountain in fire, so the revelation of godliness is Hashem's effect, Hashem's doing. And the Olam is noch dann given a gashmi v'chumri was is nit mezukach, and the world is as lowly and crass as can be imagined. It hasn't been worked with. Nobody's engaged the world yet and transformed it. Der Rebbe hat der Gilikus dann aufgetan den Bittel und Killen vom Welt in Anöfen von Har Sinai Oshan Kuloi. So therefore, the interaction between Hashem's revelation and the lowly world produces a lot of smoke, produces a lot of indication that there's transformation happening here. Was der Rebbe v'goydel Oshan weist, as die Chumri Yisraelim is nicht given Zak Mezukach. So if there's so much smoke, it's an indication the world is really still pretty stuck in its physicality. So it's got to be worked with. You can see there's a lot of trauma, there's a lot of conflict happening in the elevation of the world. But when you get to our parasha, now we're talking about a period that is after the Torah has already been given. Which means that there is already an impact that the Torah, the giving of the Torah, has made on the world, and there's been a refinement of the world. The world is not as crass as it was. It doesn't produce so much smoke. It doesn't produce so much resistance. So therefore, in our parasha, when the fiery apparition of godliness enters the scene, it doesn't produce that same resisting smoke. But because it's so much more refined, so much more sparse, it's no longer called smoke, it's called cloud. And the minute you talk about cloud, you're no longer talking about taking the world, working with the world, transforming the world, and elevating the world with the same extreme degree. So Rashi comes along and says, yes, it might be cloud, but it's not regular cloud. As onanze kemin ashanhu, even this cloud, which seems to indicate the absence of working with and refining the world, it's also a little bit of smoke. Hey, this is not the same as cloud which descends into the world purely Hashem's doing, superimposing holiness onto the world. But this is the product of an engagement, devouring, consuming the world. This is something that actually has an impact on the world. It will actually transform the world. Some of the world will actually be elevated. It won't just have godliness superimposed on it, so it's like an onon because it's not fighting the world, but it's kemin oshan because it's elevating the world. So there is some element of some kind of impurity, some kind of gray area, which indicates that the physical matter is being transformed and elevated. Because the objective of all of Torah is that the lower reality of our world should be transformed into Hashem's home, is der far onon zeh, der onon, therefore this cloud, in welchem Moshe hat gedacht reingehen, which Moshe had to enter. With what purpose? So that he could bring the Torah encased in the luchos down into the lower world, which is the objective, is kemin ashanhu. This cloud has properties of smoke. It's got the properties of what Torah will achieve, taking the world and elevating it to become a holy place. Says but we have a major advantage because the Torah has already been given, which means the whole world has been shifted to a higher reality. So therefore the smoke is no longer smoky smoke that fills the space and blurs your vision, as it was right at the beginning when they started to give the Torah. It's kemin oshan. It's a lighter version of the transformation of the physical world. What does that teach us? There are people who complain, what do I have to do with why do I have to get involved with the physical lowly world? Well, what do I need it for? If I do have to engage the physical world, so I'll deal with the animal world, I'll deal with the plant world, things that are living, that kind of have some kind of value and meaning in spiritual terms. But I really don't want to get involved in things that are inanimate, the lowest of the low. I don't want to get involved in things that don't even show, they don't even exhibit life. They're so lowly. I don't want to be involved in something that is not flammable, which means that even when you introduce godly fire into it, it doesn't respond. That the fire can't catch it. You first got to break it down into smaller components, like the Alter Rebbe describes in Tanya, and only then it has a hope of becoming flammable. I don't want to get involved. It's too removed from holiness and spirituality. I don't want to go there. So the Torah tells us, we have to generate smoke, which implies elevation, even in the lowest, most limited, finite, inanimate things. Because that's the purpose of the giving of the Torah, to hit the matter, the lowest of the low, and infuse it with godliness. As the Indian the killing and aliyah von Chemer Olam Zalufkiton Vernit Nar Inem Tzameach Na Eichin Har Doimem. The entire purpose of Torah is not to elevate the easy to elevate components of the world that are already somewhat sensitized, but dafka to find the parts of the world that are dead and elevate them. Kennen sie kommen mit noch Atainas, and then a person will say, I have another problem. Says, Doch, Misnavel the Alter Rebbe says in Tanya, if you wrestle with a person who is lowly or filthy, you also become lowly or filthy. And therefore there's a concern durch the avoid zu peil sein an Oshan in Dvarim Tachtenim. If I'm going to engage the physical realities of this world in order to hopefully elevate and transform them, what's going to happen to me? Wird doch Gerim sein soll sich einrichten. I'm also going to get smoky and sooty. It's doch gleich, man soll sich nicht vernehmen, it's better just to stay away. If them is the answer to that, we have the answer again in our parasha, in our story. Don't worry about getting contaminated. The Eibishter makes a corridor for Moshe. And we all have a Moshe. The Bechina Moshe, was is doing the Neshama von jeden Eden. We all have the pure epicenter of our Neshama, which is our personal Moshe. Sie wird sich nicht einrichten. It can never be contaminated. Sie wird bleiben rein, it will always be pure, weil sie geht durch Hashvil, because it only travels in Hashem's protective corridor. It's always absolutely dedicated to Hashem. So we'll always have a pink teliyid inside of ourselves, no matter what we do, where we go, that will remain fine. But you know what? There's even more than that. Noch mehr. When we analyze at the deepest level, even the more superficial, so to speak, accessible, revealed parts of our neshama are also protected and won't be contaminated. It's not only some deep-seated epicenter of our being that is protected from harm if we do what the Eibishter wants, it's even our conscious self that will be protected. Valen Emerson says, "Gonit kenoshan, sis blaze kemin oshan," because the smoke is not real smoke. It appears like smoke, it behaves like smoke, it's not smoke. It's actually cloud that just looks and behaves like smoke because of what it achieves. Das heißt, in other words, das was die Welt ist, the fact that the world we live in seems to obscure godliness is it's not kamin von ametzius lib dem inyan from bechira. That's only an apparition to allow us the ability for choice, but in truth, nothing can obscure and obstruct godliness. If we could see things as they are in truth, we'd never be able to make choices. So the Eibishter hides the truth, not because the obstruction is real, it's only because it allows us opportunity. And even beyond that, because any obstruction or blurring of godliness, number one, is generated by godliness, and number two, for the purpose of us achieving greater connection to Hashem and more of what Hashem wants in the world, it is actually fundamentally positive and holy in its own right. Yes, of course, it looks like smoke and it looks really scary and it looks like an obstruction. It looks like it's the kind of thing that you can never completely transform because there'll always be coal or ashes that remain afterwards. But that's only because that's our perception. But the truth is that even the so-called smoke is actually a cloud of holiness for him. Because it only exists to facilitate more holiness and light. So it's fundamentally positive. And that's the practical lesson for us. As we have to get down and dirty in the world, engage with actual physical things of the world. And that's how we gain access to Torah. So to lock ourselves away in some kind of a cloistered community and expect that we're going to have a connection to Hashem only by focusing on our own spirituality doesn't work. We have to engage the world, of course, with the guidance of Torah. And then durch dem is men kabel Torah, we can accept the Torah. Moshe Rabbeinu b'kol echad ve'echad b'chinas Moshe benafshoy. Moshe Rabbeinu, who is reflected in our personal Moshe, hat mekabel given the Torah nach der Akdama from Vayava Moshe b'seichayana. How did Moshe get the Torah? He had to first go through the cloud/smoke. Was on ze kiminashen. And it wasn't straightforward. He needed the Eibishter's protected corridor, but he went through. Even though it may feel temporarily, and it's important to note superficially, as we're in the dark, we're in a place of concealment. It's that concealment, that challenge, pushing through that challenge that gets us to be in Hashem's space 40 days and 40 nights. And then we get the Torah as the Torah is in its most pristine, perfect way, not as it's, perhaps compromised or contaminated by human intellect. And then it's not Torah that just remains theoretical Torah, but we translate it into the reality of our physical presence and the reality of our physical space. Truma, which is why we go from Pashas Mishpatim, which ends off with this message of confronting and going through the smoke and finding godliness and Torah on the other side. That takes us to next week's parasha of that we can create a place that contains Hashem within ourselves. We can take physical things, gold and silver, etc., all the materials that are described in the Torah, and transform that into Hashem's home. And that will fulfill the ultimate purpose of creation, which is that the Eibishter desired that he should have his presence revealed in an unmitigated way, dafka in the lowest of the low here on earth, and we'll achieve that through engaging the physical and transforming it to holiness. And that will bring Mashiach now.